Mrs. Marple Maddox stood at the crossroads, bidding farewell to her mother, who was preparing to return to her home after spending months with her. They exchanged parting words, their voices tinged with sorrow, and the sadness altered the tone of their speech and the expressions on their faces. Although Mrs. Marple was in her 30s and a mother of 3, she had never grown accustomed to living far from her mother. This made her stand in the middle of the road, holding her child, watching her mother gradually fade into the distance. As she waved her hand, Mrs. Marple heard the voice of a passing woman from the town who greeted her. Marple turned to return the greeting, then quickly turned her gaze back to look for her mother, but saw nothing. She was struck with astonishment, as the brief moment it took to respond to her neighbor's greeting was not enough for her mother to have reached the train station. This prompted her to hurry in the direction her mother had been walking. Mrs. Marple's mother, Mrs. Kongick, was the wife of Sir Kongick, an Air Force officer whose plane had disappeared a decade ago. Marple began searching for her mother everywhere, as though she had vanished into thin air. She left no corner or passage unchecked, even inspecting the travelers at Sodoni train station. At that moment, she realized something had happened to her mother. Without a second thought, she found herself inside the police station. "Sir, please help me. My mother disappeared right in front of me just moments ago, and I have no idea what happened to her." She said this while speaking to the police officer, who was focused on working on the computer. He then asked her to sit down and requested that she tell him exactly what had happened. After understanding the situation regarding Mrs. Kongick, he asked, "Have you checked the neighbors' houses? Perhaps she met a lady she knows and went home with her. Did you do that?" "No, all I did was search for her in the streets and alleys, even the train station, but I couldn't find her there. It was only a moment, sir, when she stopped to respond to one of the women in the town, and then I couldn't find her." The officer noticed the anxiety on her face, as well as the distress of her baby, who was crying from hunger. So he stood up from his chair, took the baby in his arms, handed her a glass of juice, and sat in the chair in front of her to continue his investigation. He asked, "How old is your mother, Mrs. Kongick?" "My mother is in her early 50s. Indeed. A woman in her 50s couldn't walk 2 kilometers in less than a minute. I couldn't even do that myself. Tell me, Mrs. Marple, does your mother, Mrs. Kongick, suffer from any illness?" She glanced quickly at the nameplate on his desk, read his name, and then said, "Yes, Mr. Jacob. She suffers from high blood pressure. She even carries her medication with her in her bag." Captain Jacob continued to gather all the evidence that could help him in his investigation. Finally, he asked her to go with a team of criminal investigators to examine the location where Mrs. Kongick had disappeared. After that, she could return home, and he would oversee the case. After the investigation team examined the scene, Officer Jacob asked, "Who was the lady who greeted you and caused you to lose track of your mother?" "It was Mrs. Jessica Harrol. If I hadn't met her, none of this would have happened." She said it with a tone of deep sorrow and frustration, and her baby's crying only added to her confusion and stress. She left the station after taking Officer Jacob's phone number to stay in contact. As for Mr. Jacob, he decided to question Mrs. Jessica at the start of his investigation into the case. The investigation team went back to their offices, and Jacob headed to Mrs. Jessica's home. "Who's out there? I'm milking the cow. Wait a moment." Jessica Harrell's voice suggested she was a practical woman, accustomed to having people come to her house often, as Mr. Jacob deduced. After a few minutes, Jessica appeared, tying something around her waist and holding a rope in her hand. She was short, plump, with an oval face, and one of her teeth showed when she spoke. As she wiped her hand across her right side, she said, "Who are you, sir? Today the cow refused to give us any milk. Maybe tomorrow it'll be kind to us. Damn thing, I hate cows because they're stubborn and boring. But my stupid husband loves raising them." He said these words and shut the door before Jacob could say anything, not even knowing what he wanted. At that point, Jacob burst out laughing, his hand resting on the door handle. He knocked again. Then she screamed, "Help me! She wants to kill me! Hurry, you fool! Harrol, where are you? The cow cut the rope and is chasing me." At that moment, Jacob entered after breaking down the door and tried to help her. He placed a large stone to secure the barn door. Once the crisis was over, Jacob muttered to himself sarcastically, this lady, who couldn't even properly close the barn door, surely cannot be involved in Mrs. Kongick's disappearance. His tired face threw out an extravagant gesture. Nevertheless, he continued the investigation. She remained calm and composed after learning that he was a detective. Even her husband, Mr. Harrol, with his tall frame and mustache hanging at the sides of his mouth, began assisting with the investigation. Mr. Harrol said, "My wife is very kind. I love her dearly. I've known her since she was a child, so she couldn't possibly be involved in any criminal activity." Jacob, shifting his stance, replied, "No, I'm not accusing her of anything. I just came to have a general conversation, as I have a case I'm assigned to investigate. Tell me, Mrs. Jessica, do you know a lady named Kongick?" Jessica relaxed and then took a matchstick, using it to pick her teeth while sitting on a chair only a few centimeters off the ground. She continued speaking. Kongick, that name doesn't sound unfamiliar. Ah, I remember now. She's Mrs. Marple's mother. Yes, I met her when I was at Marple's house last week, but I didn't talk to her much because she's so arrogant. She still lives off the grandeur of her husband, the officer. While Mrs. Jessica was speaking, her husband tried to get her attention by winking, but she didn't notice. Then he poked her in the foot and said, looking at her with sharp eyes, "We like all officers, whether they're in aviation, criminal investigations, or even the fishery police." Jacob burst out laughing and said, "Are there really fishery police officers, Mr. Harrol?" "Yes, my grandfather was a fishery officer, but the ship he was commanding drifted away into the Pacific Ocean." "Ah, you mean a naval officer then? Anyway, if you receive any information regarding Mrs. Kongick, please inform me through the police station." Jacob left the Harrol's home, feeling strangely at ease with this simple family. The time spent with them felt like a full session with a therapist. He concluded that this family rarely engaged in such behavior, but he still had to continue the investigation to uncover the truth. As Jacob was leaving Mrs. Jessica's house, he overheard the sound of an argument from inside, which prompted him to return and investigate the cause. When he reached the threshold of her house, he heard Mrs. Jessica speaking in an angry tone. "You, Madam Lola, should know the rules of our work. We don't return milk after it's been sold, but the milk is really bad. Last week the milk was spoiled and I didn't get a refund, but this time I won't let you get away with it. Give me my money back or I'll hit you." Jessica rushed toward the cow barn, grabbed a strong rope covered in cow dung, and came back threatening Lola, who was visibly furious. Jessica said, "Come near me and I'll show you what I'll do to you." Jacob intervened to stop the quarrel and said, "I don't see any reason for this fight. How much is the milk, Madam Lola?" Lola sighed, placing her hands on her hips and swaying back and forth as she spoke. "I want the money from her. She ruined our milk in the past days. Now she needs to return the cost. I asked you, how much is it?" Lola pursed her lips and then said, $5. Jacob reached into his pocket, took out the money and handed it to her, saying, "Now you can find another place to buy milk. You all live in the same area. You should maintain good relations." Lola interrupted, saying, "I treated her like a sister. Even when the cow fell into that hole, I called my husband to leave work and help her. But she doesn't deserve the help." From what Mrs. Lola had said, Jacob caught the last sentence and quickly asked, "Where did Mrs. Jessica's cow fall into a hole?" Jessica gestured with her hand and said, "Over there by the limestone, but also I rewarded your husband by giving him 5 kilograms of meat and 4 kilograms of milk. I was generous with him too. Let's leave that now. Could you show me the hole where the cow fell?" "Yes, of course, sir." Once Jacob reached the hole, he noticed that it was covered with a rubber sheet, making it easy to fall into. Additionally, the hole was large enough for 2 people to enter. At that moment, Jacob pulled out his phone and called for rescue assistance from the civil protection team. Moments later, the team arrived and entered the hole. Jacob then realized that Mrs. Kong hadn't disappeared. She had fallen into the hole. Mrs. Marple couldn't believe that her mother was alive. The rescue operation took 6 hours of intense work, which attracted a group of media outlets to the area to cover the event. In the end, Mrs. Kongick was saved after spending 2 weeks in the hospital. But it didn't end there. Even her missing husband was found. The search team discovered human bones inside the hole, and through the investigation it was revealed that her husband and several other missing people from the town were victims of that hole.